So now we're going to get into creating basic patterns, a basic front bodice, a basic back, a basic skirt front and back. And these patterns are going to be altered so that we can create the design we see before us. But before you can create any design in pattern making, you first need to learn how to make these basic designs and basic blocks, and they will help you develop over time, branching out and altering them to make other designs. So let's first get started on our basic bodice. As you can see here, I've lightly traced out a bodice because I found in the past when I have been taught how to create a basic bodice, it was kind of difficult for me to see what I was supposed to create without actually having a highlight of how everything was supposed to connect. So in my research and my reading, when I discovered the pattern making book, I realized a lot of the examples she had there, they had the actual highlight of the bodice, and then you saw her drawing in the line. For my front and back bodice, I use my size 8 mannequin. So if you're wondering where the measurements are coming from this particular bodice pattern, it's coming from that. I'm just going to use a half scale dress form to show you guys where I'm getting these measurements from and how I'm coming to determining where these measurements will be. So first we're going to start with this first line that I've already created. And this is going to be my center front line. And I labeled it A and B. And a center front line is essentially this line right here. So I started from the top of this point of my dress form, and then I went all the way past the waist to this line. So from here to here, I got 18.5. And I just took that and made a line from point A to point B. And made that first initial line. So my next line is going to be my point A to C line. And how I'm going to get this line is, it's going to come from here to here. So this is me sort of creating an outline for what my shoulder is going to be. And that was 7. So I'm going to draw that in. You should probably have handy, obviously, some of the tools you're going to need. You're going to need that grid ruler. You're going to need that hip ruler. But definitely you're going to need the French curve. So these are just some of the rulers you're going to need to create your lines. I also put together some different color pencils, eraser, and a pencil. And these are just to help you understand where the different lines are being created. And the way I did it was, if it was all in one color, you wouldn't really understand how each step builds upon itself. They were each not done in a different color. So that's the reason for the different color pencils. You can use whatever colors you like. These are I just use colors that I thought would best pick up on film. So I'm going to go with my red for this first layer of lines. And I'm going to use my grid ruler. And at that point, I'm going a little too past 18. So at that line, I'm going to square up my ruler at the top of this line. And I'm going to go over to 7. So once the best thing about pattern paper is these lines, these numbers, help you make sure that you're staying in line so that my lines aren't off. So these numbers are really good indicators to make sure your lines are where they're supposed to be. So that's going to be my first line. And I'm going to mark this C. And from this C point, I'm going to square down about 3 inches. So I'm going to make sure my lines are even, using the numbers to guide me to make sure that I'm making a straight line. Okay. Next, I'm going to get my B to D line, and you're going to see what this is going to form very shortly. I marked this area right here because this is the actual waistline, but we're gonna go a little past the waistline, but this just helps me remember, okay, this is the actual waistline when I'm sort of cross-checking my measurements to make sure they match up with what I got for the mannequin. Okay, so my next line is, I said, the B to D line. And just to show you on the mannequin, that's gonna be from here past the waistline. So this is from here to here is where I marked on my actual larger scale mannequin. And that comes to 15.5. So I'm gonna mark down from the bottom. And I'm gonna just create about a 2-inch line from that mark. So I'm gonna mark down from this bottom, point B, up to this point, 15.5, and I'm gonna mark that D. My next line is going to be from B to E, and this is going to be just a straight line that's going to be a guide for our waist area, and it's also going to guide us as far as our dart area. So that line is going to be from here to here. Okay, and for my mannequin, that came up to about 9.5. So I'm going to take my ruler and I'm going to hit that point and I'm going to make a straight line. So this is 9.5. I'm going to bring my ruler straight across, make sure it's nice and even, using those numbers as a guide, and just bringing that line straight across. Okay. Then I'm gonna square up about 15 inches from the end of point E. So I'm first gonna mark point E. Make sure you do that. These are all gonna be important indicators. I'm gonna go down where that says 15. Again, using the numbers as a guide. That's why pattern paper is so important. It cuts out some of the guesswork as far as, are these lines even? So from, make sure I get that point. From point E, I'm gonna go up, 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 stop. Get that nice and bold. So far in this exercise, we've covered point C, we've covered point A, point D, point B, and point E. Next, we're gonna go on to our next steps. Now, using a blue color pencil, I'm gonna go on to the next steps of marking for my front bodice pattern. So now we're gonna get points B to G, and how that measurement is taken is I use my mannequin and I measure from the shoulder point diagonally across to that center seam, that center front. So it's from the shoulder point diagonally until we get about here. And that's how I'm gonna get that measurement. And that comes up to 18 for me. So I'm gonna use my grid ruler and I'm gonna measure up from B. So I'm gonna start at B. I'm gonna measure up using the numbers once again as a guide to make sure I get that line as straight as possible. Okay. So we're gonna label that point G. Now to get my G to H line, just make sure that's colored in. I'm gonna measure, and it's just to show you what line that is exactly. So I'm gonna go back to that shoulder point and I'm gonna go a little past, because now we're trying to get the area to mark the bust area. So we're gonna be creating our bust line. So that's gonna be the shoulder point, past the bust, to around here. And it might seem off, but you'll see as we begin to create the lines what that's going to look like. So for me, that measurement is 9 inches. So I'm going to take my ruler and measure down 9. And at that area, I'm just going to make a little circle, and I'm going to mark that H. Okay. It might seem a little bit tricky, and again, that's why I encourage you, if you're able to, go to a pattern store, get a basic pattern, trace it, a basic bodice pattern, trace it, and use it as practice. I'm also going to be giving you PDFs of all the bodices at a half scale, and you can actually do these, trace them on tracing paper, practice at a half scale, and then you can build on until you're ready to move up to the full scale. So again, in your PDFs, you're going to get copies of the blocks, front, back, skirt, front, and back. And I encourage you to use tracing paper. They are at half scale, but you can use tracing paper and move along with the same exact steps, just on a half scale, until you're comfortable with getting the lines and understanding the measurements and why you're doing the lines. And just use this video as a guide, but also understand you're doing it at a half scale, so the measurements are going to be obviously not as lengthy as the ones that I'm going to be using for an actual large scale mannequin, but it's wonderful for practice. Okay, let's move on. So we said now we're getting our G to I. So for that marking, and that's going to be our shoulder marking. So G to I is our shoulder. So that's going to be from about right here rather, to here. Okay, and for me, that was 5 inches. So I'm going to measure from G, and I'm just going to go diagonally up until I hit this line right here. So I'm going to start here at 5, and then I'm just going to have a diagonal line until my line touches that CA line. And that is going to become point I. So you can already start to see, if you look at the highlighted areas, in contrast to the lightly penciled areas, you're starting to see where some of those points are being made and why some of those points are being made, what the purpose of those lines are. So my next line is from G to I. I'm going to just, at point I, I'm just going to have a slant line. There's no particular measurement. You're just connecting at a diagonal lines I and D. And you want to get as close as possible on the diagonal. If I can measurement, it looks to be about 1 inch. And you're not going to mark this anything. This is just going to be a line that you're going to use later. So for J to K, now we're going to go back to the bust area. And we're going to measure for the actual bust line. And that is going to be from J to K is this area right here. So the center front to the apex, that's this line right here. And you're going to mark it K. So it's just it's called the arc of the bust. So we call that the arc of the bust. So we just take our line, it's about, we come in at about 3. So now using our green color pencil, or whatever color pencil you decide to use, again, I encourage you to use different color pencils for each step that we're doing. So right now we're on to step 3 of the bodice. So each time I change the color, that's when we're moving up a step. So we're up to step 3. Now I'm going to be creating another series of lines using the green. So the next line that I'm going to be creating is using point I. I'm going to be measuring diagonally across, because now we're working on getting the swing of the bodice as well as creating that excess space to create a dart. And what is a dart? A dart is what we use to mold our garments. So most garments need darts unless they are made out of a super stretchy material where it just clings to the body. Any structured garment is going to require a dart. And there's just these triangular shapes that we create on garments, and there's a variety of where they're placed. There's shoulder, there are bust darts, there's waist darts, there's all kinds of areas for darts. They can go both front and back, and then on the skirt portions of a garment. So darts are just to keep form and just to make sure that especially the very structured fabrics are allowed to give the body a shape. Okay, so with that measurement, I measured 17 diagonally. So for our end point, we're going to need to start at the eye and measure down till we get to 17. So I got to get a little further down. Actually 18. 18 should be my marking point because I want to get there. So I'm going to go up to I, and I'm going to make sure that line is even. You don't want to, like I did with L, you don't want your lines to be off. I'm just going to lightly go first and just make sure I'm getting those lines. Like I said, this is measuring at about 18 inches. My ruler goes up to 18, so I'm still going to need to stretch it just a little bit. Once I'm pretty comfortable that that's a straight line, I'm just going to go in and make that line a little bit darker. And now we're creating room for our dart. And I'm going to just label that down here, N. And as you can see, it's hitting right just above, I would say, about 1.25 inches before the lines meet and intersect with the green and red. So it doesn't meet directly at point E, it goes about 1.25 inches up and it makes point N. Use this diagonal line and not this as a measurement, but it's helping you have an idea that we're not exactly matching point I and point E. It's slightly above. That's why I gave you that measurement. So to get point O, I'm not actually going to draw a line. I'm just going to measure about 10 inches up. Again, these are the measurements that I have for my dress form. If you're using your personal body as the template, if you're using what you need to make sure you adhere to those measurements. This is a standard size 8 mannequin that I used for mine. So to create that swing line, I'm just gonna go to point N and mark about 2 inches out at a slant. So it's not going to be straight across. At a slight slant, I'm just going to go up and mark that across 2 inches. And I'm going to label that point P. And then I'm just going to connect point P to point O. And make sure you get a nice straight line. You can always go lightly at first and then go darker once you feel more confident about the strength of how straight that line is. And for point P, we're going to have to create another line so that we're still, again, working on that dart area. So I'm going to take point P and connect it to F. So I'm not connecting at N, I'm taking it straight across and connecting point P at a diagonal to point F. So you can see me going along right here. Always go lightly and then heavier if you need to. Okay, so now we can start to see some of those areas as we're creating spaces for darts, armholes, shoulder seams. It's coming together. So let's move on to our next step. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe. Videos covering dressmaking, fashion, lectures, and more.